Tonight, we uncover a story buried not in myth, but in marble, a story of ink, secrets, and silence. The tale of a pact made between a man who dreamed of empire and a church that ruled eternity. They say power and faith should never share the same table, but in the summer of 1933, they did. Behind closed doors, with no witnesses and no light, a treaty was signed that would change history. Its promise was protection. Its price was something far greater. Some call it diplomacy. Others call it the Church's darkest bargain. For decades, this story has been edited, footnoted, and carefully rewritten. The documents exist, the photographs too, but the truth lies in what was never meant to be said aloud. In the years that followed, priests blessed soldiers, bishops met with men in black uniforms, and from Rome's highest windows, a silent figure watched as the world turned to ash. The church that once defied kings now faced a dictator and chose to speak in whispers. Some said that silence saved lives, others believed it damned them. Letters still exist, written by hands that trembled with conscience. Reports smuggled through war zones, confessions sealed in archives still locked today. They speak of priests who risked everything to save the hunted, and others who turned away. They speak of gold moved through secret banks, of nuns who forged names, and of refugees who vanished into new lives under new blessings. And behind it all, the question that no one dares to ask: did the Vatican's silence keep faith alive? Or did it allow evil to wear holiness as its mask? For nearly a century, the official story has been one of neutrality, of patience, of strategy. But history has a longer memory than men. It remembers the meetings that were never photographed, the names written and then erased, the voices that broke under the weight of obedience. It remembers the nights when radio waves carried coded prayers and the days when pulpits fell quiet. So before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, because tonight we are not just revisiting history, we are unlocking it. We will step into the Vatican's hidden corridors, where letters were burned, where faith was tested, and where morality became a currency. This is not a tale of saints or sinners, but of choices made in candlelight and secrets kept in stone. What really happened between Hitler and the Vatican is not in the headlines. It's in the spaces between them. And if you listen closely enough, you'll hear what power tried to forget and what memory refused to let die. They say every deal with the devil starts in silence. In the summer of 1933, behind the marble walls of the Vatican, a single door closed and the world changed. No witnesses, no cameras, just a pen, paper, and the sound of signatures being written that would bind two of the most powerful forces in Europe, the Holy See and the Third Reich. The treaty was called the Reichskonkordat. To the Church, it promised protection, freedom to worship, and safety for its institutions. To Hitler, it gave something far more valuable: legitimacy, a handshake with God's representative on earth. That moment turned faith into politics, and politics into something darker. Germany was still trembling from the chaos after the Great War. People were hungry, scared, and desperate for order. The Church wanted stability. Hitler wanted obedience. When both sides looked at each other across that table, they didn't see enemies. They saw opportunity. For the Vatican, the deal meant it could protect Catholic schools, priests, and property from the chaos of nationalism. For Hitler, it meant the most powerful moral voice in the world had just recognized his government. He could point to Rome and say, "See, even the Church stands with me." But what was really written between the lines? Historians say the treaty's words look harmless. They talk about religious freedom, mutual respect, peace. Yet every word came with a shadow. The moment the ink dried, Catholic political groups in Germany were ordered to dissolve. Catholic newspapers were told to stay silent on politics. Priests were warned not to speak against the new regime. The Church thought it was saving itself, but in doing so, it may have silenced the last voice strong enough to challenge what was coming. Inside the Vatican, some believed it was a smart move. They argued that by staying friendly with Hitler, they could protect millions of believers. They told themselves it was better to keep the doors open than to risk persecution. But outside, the streets of Berlin were changing fast. Crosses were coming down from classrooms. Children were being taught that loyalty to the Führer was loyalty to God. And while the church prayed for peace, the world began to prepare for war. Even today, the archives from that time still feel cold. Some say the Vatican acted out of fear, others out of faith. Maybe both. It's easy to judge in hindsight, but imagine being in that room in 1933, knowing one wrong move could put millions of lives in danger. Do you stand up to evil and risk everything, or do you stay silent, hoping to guide it from within? That's the question that still haunts this story. The Concordat was supposed to protect the church. Instead, it became one of history's most controversial bargains. A signature meant to defend faith that ended up defending power. And when the door finally opened again, the world outside was already changing into something no prayer could stop. Long before he became Pope Pius XII, Eugenio Pacelli was already walking through the heart of Germany's storm. It was the early 1920s. Berlin was a city trying to rebuild itself after the Great War. The streets buzzed with jazz clubs and hunger, art and anger, hope and despair. And in the middle of that chaos stood a tall, quiet priest from Rome, dressed in black, carrying letters that could shape the future. He was not a preacher, he was a diplomat, the Vatican's man in Germany, the papal nuncio. Pacelli was known for his calm voice and sharp mind. He spoke fluent German, listened more than he talked, and took notes on everything. Ministers, generals, bankers, revolutionaries, all passed through his office. He smiled, nodded, and remembered every word. He understood that the real power in a collapsing country was not always on the stage, it was in the shadows. And Germany, in those years, had many shadows. The old empire was gone, democracy was weak, and new movements were whispering about purity, strength, and destiny. Pacelli heard them first. He saw what others ignored, a hunger for control hiding behind speeches about unity. He wrote letters back to Rome warning about the rise of dangerous ideas, about men using religion as a tool. His words were polite, but filled with concern. He called it a sickness spreading through the nation's soul. The Vatican listened, but the world was tired of warnings. They wanted stability, not prophecy. Pacelli watched as politicians promised miracles they could never deliver. He saw churches trying to hold people together as the streets filled with fear and slogans. By the late 1920s, he had met many of the men who would soon wear the uniforms of the new regime. He understood their charm, their ambition, and their thirst for recognition. He also saw how easily faith could be bent to serve power. In his private notes, he wrote about the danger of mixing symbols of the cross with symbols of the state. To him, it was a kind of blasphemy. But to the crowd, it looked like hope. Pacelli believed in diplomacy, in careful words and quiet influence. He thought that through treaties and conversations, the church could calm the storm before it became a hurricane. He wasn't naive, but he believed that silence, used wisely, could be more powerful than confrontation. It was a belief that would define the rest of his life. When he left Berlin in the early 1930s, the city was already trembling. Brown uniforms marched in the streets. The newspapers spoke of destiny and cleansing. Pacelli packed his files, his reports, and his quiet dread. He had seen enough to know that Germany was about to change forever. Years later, when he became Pope, that same quiet man who once walked the corridors of Berlin would face a choice that would test everything he believed about silence, diplomacy, and the cost of doing nothing. It was Palm Sunday, 1937. Across Germany, church bells rang, echoing through villages and cities that had already learned to whisper their prayers carefully. Inside thousands of churches, priests unfolded papers that had arrived in secret, hidden in suitcases, and smuggled under the eyes of the Gestapo. No one outside the church knew what was about to happen. What they held in their hands was a letter from Rome, written in German, not Latin, a warning disguised as a sermon. Its name was Mit brennender Sorge, with burning concern. It would be the only time in history that the Vatican directly addressed the German people, not their leaders, in their own language. The words were sharp and fearless. They condemned the Nazis' false gods, the worship of race, blood, and power. They called out the lies that had twisted truth into propaganda. The letter warned that anyone who replaced faith with ideology was walking the path of ruin. It didn't name Hitler, but everyone knew who it meant. For the first time, the church's voice had broken through the silence, and it came from every pulpit on the same day. No newspapers, no broadcasts. Just thousands of voices reading the same message, echoing through cathedrals and small stone chapels. For a few hours, truth had a sound. The regime reacted with fury. Within days, priests were arrested, printing presses were raided, and copies of the letter were seized and burned. The government called it a betrayal. The Vatican called it courage. But the people caught in the middle, the parish priests, the nuns, the believers, paid the price. The Gestapo began watching masses more closely. Confessionals were searched. Schools were shut down. It was clear that words could be more dangerous than weapons. Behind the scenes, the man who helped draft the letter was the same Eugenio Pacelli who had once walked the streets of Berlin. As the Vatican's Secretary of State, he had seen enough to know that silence could no longer protect the Church, but even he understood the cost. The encyclical was meant to be a single blazing statement, not a war. It was Rome's attempt to remind the world that faith and fear could not share the same altar, yet the backlash was swift and terrifying. Every priest who spoke those words risked his freedom, sometimes his life. Some were dragged from their churches before the last hymn had ended. Still, the message spread, whispered, copied, passed hand to hand. It became a quiet act of rebellion, a candle in the dark. The Nazis couldn't erase it completely. They could burn paper, but they couldn't unhear what had been said. For one Sunday, the church had spoken with fire, and when the echo faded, the Vatican was left with a new kind of silence, one filled with fear and questions. Could words alone stand against a machine built on obedience and violence? Or had Rome just awakened a beast it could no longer control? When war began to spread across Europe, the man once known as Eugenio Pacelli became Pope Pius XII. The same quiet diplomat who had walked Berlin's corridors now sat on the throne of St. Peter, faced with a storm greater than any before. The world expected thunder. The world got silence. And that silence became one of the most debated sounds in history. Some said it was wisdom, others called it fear. But for the people living through the chaos, it was simply confusing. When bombs fell on cities and trains carried millions toward death, the question grew louder. Why wasn't the Pope speaking? Inside the Vatican, things were not as still as they seemed. Letters moved like ghosts through hidden channels. Bishops, diplomats, and even nuns carried messages across borders. There were secret meetings with ambassadors, coded pleas for mercy, and quiet orders to open convents to refugees. The Pope believed his voice could do more harm than good if used carelessly. He feared that an open condemnation would provoke Hitler further, leading to even greater slaughter, not only of Jews, but also of Catholics living under Nazi control. He thought silence could be a shield, a way to act without drawing attention, but silence has a cost. Outside the Vatican walls, the world was starving for moral clarity. People wanted someone to name the evil aloud, to stand in the pulpit of St. Peter's and call the darkness by its real name. Every day of quiet began to sound like agreement. Every measured word from the Vatican seemed to echo back as hesitation. There were bishops who begged him to speak louder, to shout the truth so the world would know that God still saw the victims. But Pius believed diplomacy, not defiance, was the key to survival. Historians still argue about what he knew and when he knew it. Some say the Vatican had detailed reports of the camps, the executions, and the machinery of genocide. Others say the information came in fragments, impossible to confirm. Either way, the question remains: should he have spoken sooner, louder? Did his quiet save more than it cost? Or did it allow evil to move unchecked? In those years, the Pope carried the weight of 1 billion souls. He knew that one word could inspire hope, but it could also trigger revenge. He believed that behind the veil of silence, he could work miracles through whispers, through letters, through priests who risked everything to shelter the hunted. Some of those lives were saved, others were not. When the war finally ended, the silence did not. It turned into an echo that filled history books and courtroom debates. Was it strategy or surrender? A shield or a silence too heavy to defend? No answer fits perfectly. The truth is that every word not spoken left a space for judgment, and every life saved in secret left a question that history still struggles to ask out loud. Every great betrayal begins with a promise. The Reichskonkordat of 1933 looked harmless enough on paper. It was a treaty meant to protect the rights of the Catholic Church in a rapidly changing Germany. It spoke of freedom for worship, the safety of religious schools, and respect for spiritual authority. Signed by representatives of the Vatican and the Nazi government, it seemed like a pact of peace between faith and state. But hidden inside its careful language were cracks that would soon widen into control. What looked like protection became permission. What looked like peace became silence. The fine print was filled with guarantees that the regime never truly intended to honour. The Church agreed not to interfere in politics. In return, it was promised the right to teach, to publish, and to organise youth groups. But the moment the ink dried, those same promises began to dissolve. Catholic newspapers found themselves censored or shut down for printing anything that questioned the new order. Youth organisations were told to merge with the Hitler Youth, or disband completely. The pulpit was declared sacred, but only if it avoided subjects that could offend the state. Every clause that was meant to protect ended up being used as a tool to control. The regime had learned something powerful. It discovered that obedience could be harvested through legality. By wrapping control in the language of law, it could make surrender look like cooperation. The Church wanted to believe that by following the rules, it could keep its flock safe. But the rules were written by men who had no intention of keeping faith with anyone. They used the treaty as a mask, a way to appear respectable in the eyes of the world. When diplomats asked about religious freedom in Germany, officials could smile and point to the signed document. See, they would say, even the Vatican trusts us. Inside the Church, there were growing doubts. Priests began to notice that their sermons were being watched. Letters from bishops were intercepted. Schools once filled with children learning about God now displayed portraits of the Führer beside the crucifix. The Concordat had become a cage lined with scripture. It protected buildings, but not truth. And when some priests tried to speak out, the government simply reminded them of their agreement to stay out of politics. Still, the Vatican hoped that patience would pay off, that cooperation could soften tyranny. But by the time the truth became clear, it was too late. The fine print had already done its work. The treaty that was supposed to guard faith had become the instrument of its manipulation. Hitler had gained what he wanted most: legitimacy. And the Church, trapped by its own desire to keep peace, found itself defending a document while the world around it descended into darkness. In the end, the Concordat protected neither faith nor freedom. It became a lesson written not in ink but in silence, a reminder that even holy agreements can be used as chains when signed with the wrong hand. There were moments when silence cracked, when the air inside German churches trembled with words that refused to obey. In the early years of the Nazi regime, while most of the nation learned to lower its voice, a few bishops stepped forward and spoke. They did not shout in the streets or lead protests. They stood at the pulpit, under stained glass and candlelight, and turned sermons into acts of resistance. Cardinal Michael von Faulhaber of Munich was one of them. His words cut through fear like a blade hidden in prayer. In 1933, he dared to defend the Old Testament, at a time when Nazi propaganda called it the book of a foreign race. He reminded his people that Christianity itself was born from Jewish roots. His church overflowed with listeners, some weeping, some terrified, and outside the doors stood uniformed men with notebooks, writing down his every word. Faulhaber's sermons reached Rome and were copied in secret. He was questioned, threatened, and watched, yet he kept speaking. To him, silence was a sin worse than danger. Then came Bishop Clemens August von Galen of Münster, the man they would later call the Lion of Münster. In 1941, he stood before his congregation and denounced the Nazi program of euthanasia. The government had begun quietly killing the sick, the disabled, and the unwanted, calling it mercy. Von Galen called it murder. He told his people that no one, not even the state, had the right to decide who was worthy of life. His words were copied and passed from town to town. They spread faster than the Gestapo could stop them. The regime was furious. Propaganda officials demanded his arrest. Others warned that such an act might spark rebellion in a country still deeply Catholic. Hitler ordered him silenced, but not imprisoned. The state feared his martyrdom more than his voice. Still, the price for his courage was paid by others. Priests who repeated his message vanished. Printing presses that circulated his sermons were raided. Parish newspapers were shut down overnight. Not all bishops were brave. Many stayed quiet, believing that obedience would protect their churches from destruction. But the few who spoke reminded the world that faith was not meant to serve power. Their defiance showed that words, when spoken with conviction, could shake even the most ruthless empire. By the end of the war, some of these voices were gone. Some were imprisoned, others broken by constant pressure. Yet their sermons survived, copies hidden in walls, whispered through families, and passed like relics to the next generation. They became proof that even in a world where truth was punished, the church was not entirely silent. A few refused to follow the script written by fear. And because they did, history remembers that courage is not measured by victory, but by the choice to speak when speaking could destroy you. In the years when Europe was swallowed by war, the most powerful weapon in the Vatican's arsenal was not an army or a treaty. It was a microphone. From a small studio inside the Vatican walls, a voice began to travel through the airwaves, crossing mountains, borders, and front lines. Vatican Radio had been founded in 1931, long before the world realized how dangerous words could be. But by the time the bombs began to fall, the air itself had become a battlefield, and every broadcast carried both hope and risk. The microphone became a chalice, holding messages that could save lives or destroy them. The Vatican's broadcasts were different from any others. They didn't shout slogans or play anthems. They spoke carefully, choosing every word as if it were a secret code. Reports about missing families, wounded soldiers, and prisoners were read in calm voices. They mentioned no names, yet many listeners knew exactly who was being spoken about. Hidden inside the phrasing were pleas for mercy, signals to diplomats, and quiet warnings to those who still dared to resist. The programs reached deep into occupied Europe, even into the homes of those who listened in fear behind closed curtains, afraid of being caught with the radio turned to the wrong station. The Nazis quickly realized that these broadcasts were more than news. They were messages wrapped in faith. They carried the sound of a world that refused to surrender to hate. German officials labelled the station as an enemy of the state. Listening became a crime, but still, people tuned in. A few minutes of forbidden sound became a lifeline, proof that not everyone had bowed to the regime. Vatican Radio spoke of prisoners, refugees, and the starving. It talked of dignity, of compassion, of God's law above man's. Each word was measured, because one wrong phrase could lead to arrests or retaliation. Inside the studio, the engineers and priests who ran the station worked like spies. They coded messages, translated reports from the Red Cross, and prepared updates for families searching for loved ones. Some programs were broadcast in secret languages known only to certain diplomats or bishops. Others were open prayers for peace, their tone soft but their meaning sharp. Pius XII himself approved many of these transmissions, understanding that even without names, the truth could travel farther than any army. But the risk was enormous. The Reich jammed the signals, hunted down listeners, and spread propaganda calling the Vatican a nest of traitors. Still, the broadcasts continued. The voice of Vatican radio became the heartbeat of silent resistance, a reminder that even in war, conscience could still speak. And when the war ended, many survivors said they remembered those voices in the night more clearly than any sermon. Because in the darkest years of the century, faith found a way to fly through the static, and truth, carried on invisible waves, refused to be silenced. When the trains began to move at night, the world learned to whisper. Across Europe, the streets fell silent as doors were kicked open and neighbours disappeared. But somewhere between the fear and the faith, a hidden network began to grow. It had no single leader, no flag, and no name. It was made of priests, nuns, monks, and ordinary Catholics who decided that obedience had gone too far. They turned churches into shelters, convents into hiding places, and confessionals into channels of information. It was a quiet rebellion that saved lives in the dark. In Rome, Florence, Paris, and countless villages, the pattern was the same. A stranger would appear at the back of a chapel, trembling, sometimes carrying nothing but a folded photograph. A nun would meet their eyes and know without asking. The doors would close, food would appear, a plan would form, forged baptism papers, new names, train tickets, or the address of a monastery willing to take them in. Many of these helpers never saw themselves as heroes. They said they were simply doing what faith required when law turned cruel. The Vatican itself became a strange kind of sanctuary. Inside its walls, dozens of Jews and refugees were hidden in plain sight, dressed as workers, gardeners, and even seminarians. Monasteries surrounding Rome opened their gates at night to those fleeing deportation. The Pope knew some of it, perhaps not all, but enough to understand that beneath the Church's silence, small armies of compassion were moving quietly. Their courage was not in speeches, but in footsteps. There were priests who rode bicycles between towns, carrying secret letters. Nuns who used laundry carts to smuggle children out of ghettos. Laymen who pretended to repair radios while slipping false documents into coat pockets. Every act was a risk. If caught, it meant arrest, torture, or execution. Yet they kept going. They said they were not following orders, but conscience. That faith meant nothing if it did not protect life. Not everyone helped. Some turned away. Some were afraid. The network was uneven, its strength depending on the bravery of a few and the silence of the many. Still, it stretched farther than anyone could have imagined. After the war, survivors told stories of candlelight in convent corridors, of whispered prayers in cellars, of hands that offered bread instead of betrayal. Many of those names were never recorded. Their deeds vanished in time, but the lives they saved did not. Historians would later call it the network in the night. It was imperfect and disorganized, but it proved that even in a world drowning in cruelty, faith could still find form in human hands. It did not end the war or stop the horror, but it defied it. And when the trains kept moving, there were still doors that opened. There were still people who refused to forget what it meant to be human, even when humanity seemed lost. War is never just fought with guns. It is fought with gold, with banks, with ledgers that record the price of survival. When the world descended into chaos, Even the Vatican found itself entangled in the quiet war of money. Behind its marble walls lay a small but powerful institution, the Vatican Bank. It was supposed to protect the church's assets, fund charities, and manage donations from the faithful. But during the years of the Second World War, that mission grew complicated. The lines between charity, neutrality, and complicity began to blur. Every transaction carried a shadow. The Vatican declared itself neutral, hoping to act as a bridge between nations. But neutrality in wartime is never clean. Gold moved across borders, currencies were exchanged, and banks became hiding places for more than just coins. Some say the Vatican Bank accepted deposits from governments tied to the Axis powers. Others argue it was simply protecting church property from confiscation. The truth is tangled in paperwork and secrecy. Many documents were destroyed, others locked away for decades. What remains is a fog that historians still try to navigate. Throughout occupied Europe, the church ran hospitals, orphanages, and relief networks. Money was needed for food, medicine, and shelter. But where that money came from, and how it was transferred, became a moral labyrinth. Some funds may have come from assets once owned by Jewish families forced to flee. Others passed through hands connected to regimes that were already guilty of terrible crimes. The Vatican insisted it was acting in good faith, using every resource to keep its humanitarian work alive. But critics wondered if it had done enough to question the origins of its gold. There were also rumours that church officials helped move wealth for others seeking to escape the wreckage of the Reich, from businessmen to soldiers, and sometimes worse. Whether this was mercy or manipulation depends on who tells the story. To some, it was an act of charity for the desperate. To others, it was a quiet transaction that blurred the border between salvation and self-interest. Inside the Vatican, moral debates unfolded behind closed doors. Could the church refuse money that could feed the starving just because its source was unclean? Could it risk losing everything by exposing financial ties that might keep its institutions alive? Pius XII faced impossible choices. He believed that keeping the Vatican stable meant keeping a platform for peace. Yet, in protecting that stability, he opened the church to accusations that it had profited from neutrality while millions suffered. When the war ended, investigators and journalists tried to trace the gold. Some of it vanished. Some of it reappeared in post-war reconstruction funds. The Vatican remained silent, calling its records sacred and private, and so the mystery endured. The question was not just where the money went, but what conscience is worth when it is weighed against survival. In a world at war, even the holiest vaults could not escape the price of compromise. He was called the scholar in the cassock, a quiet man with sharp eyes and fluent Latin, a bishop who seemed more professor than priest. Alois Hudal had spent years studying theology and philosophy, writing about faith and culture, building bridges between Rome and the German-speaking world. But after the Second World War, his name would be whispered in another context. Some said he was a saviour, others called him a smuggler of evil. His mission, at least as he described it, was mercy for the displaced. But history would remember it as something darker, the beginning of what came to be known as the rat lines. In the ruins of post-war Europe, millions wandered with no homes, no names, and no nations. Refugee camps overflowed with civilians, prisoners, and soldiers alike. Among them hid those the world wanted to forget, former officers, collaborators, and men whose hands were stained with crimes that had no forgiveness. In this chaos, the church stepped in to provide aid. Passports were forged, Red Cross documents issued, and safe houses opened. To Hudal, this was an act of compassion. He believed that even the fallen deserved a second chance, that war had turned everyone into a victim of circumstance. But the line between compassion and complicity began to blur. From his base at the German College of Santa Maria dell'Anima In Rome, Hudal worked quietly. He met men who arrived under false names, desperate and afraid. He helped them find papers, contacts, and routes out of Europe, often to South America. Argentina, Brazil, and Chile became distant destinations of redemption or escape. He said he was helping Christians find safety in a world hungry for revenge. But many of those he aided were not innocent refugees. They were members of the Nazi regime, wanted for atrocities committed across Europe. Hudal's writings offered clues to his beliefs. In his book, he spoke of reconciliation and the dangers of collective guilt. He argued that the Church's duty was to heal, not judge. To some, it sounded noble. To others, it was a justification for sheltering men who should have faced justice. He was never officially condemned by the Vatican, but he was quietly distanced, stripped of influence, and left in silence. The Church, facing growing scrutiny, chose not to defend or deny him. He became a ghost in his own lifetime, neither villain nor saint, but something uneasier, a symbol of moral confusion in the aftermath of war. When Hudal died in the late 1960s, he left behind no confession, only a legacy tangled in secrecy. The corridors he once walked are still haunted by questions. Was he driven by faith, by ideology, or by fear of a world that had lost mercy? The rat lines he helped create saved lives, but also protected guilt. And in that contradiction lies one of history's most troubling lessons, that even in the name of compassion, choices can cast shadows that last for generations. In the heart of the Balkans during the Second World War, a new state was born from blood and betrayal. The independent state of Croatia rose in 1941 under the shadow of the Axis powers. Its leader, Ante Pavelić, and his Ustaša movement promised independence and purity, but what followed was a nightmare carved into history. The regime's symbol was a twisted cross, and beneath it, hundreds of thousands of Serbs, Jews, and Roma were hunted, forced to convert, or killed. It was a time when faith itself was dragged into the mud, when priests and soldiers stood on the same ground but for very different reasons. The Ustaše claimed to defend Christianity, calling their mission holy. They built altars next to prisons and baptized conversions that came at the edge of a blade. Some Catholic clergy supported the new state, seeing it as a chance to preserve faith in a world collapsing under war. Others looked away, convincing themselves that silence was safer than resistance. But not all priests stayed silent. Some protested, begged their bishops to speak, or secretly helped those condemned to die. The church in Croatia became a mirror of the nation itself, split between conscience and fear. The camps at Jasenovac and Stara Gradiška became the heart of the horror. Survivors spoke of forced baptisms, where conversion was a ticket to life, though sometimes only for a few days. The Vatican received reports from its envoys about massacres and brutality. Letters reached Rome, describing atrocities committed under the banner of Catholic nationalism. The Pope's diplomats urged moderation, pleaded for mercy, but their words fell into the noise of war. When asked later how much the Vatican knew, historians found the answer hidden in half-burned telegrams and cautious language. Enough to understand, not enough to stop it. After the war, as the Ustaša fled and Croatia lay in ruins, questions began to rise like smoke from the ashes. How deep was the Church's involvement? How much was faith used as a mask for politics? The answers were never simple. Some priests were executed by the new communist regime for their ties to the Ustaša, guilty or not. Others were celebrated for saving lives, sheltering refugees, or condemning violence from their pulpits. The Vatican mourned the loss of a Catholic nation to communism, yet could not fully face the moral damage left behind by those who had twisted the cross into a weapon. Decades later, the arguments still burn. Monuments are built, then torn down. Historians debate numbers and motives, but behind it all remains a single truth that refuses to fade. When faith becomes fused with power, and religion is used to justify hate, both God and humanity lose their reflection. Croatia's dark crossroads remind us that belief without compassion can turn sacred ground into a battlefield, and that the scars of those choices can outlive every war. In the spring of 1941, as the world tore itself apart, a new flag rose over Zagreb. The independent state of Croatia had been declared, backed by Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy. At first, it looked like a dream of independence, a long-awaited rebirth for a small nation caught between empires. But beneath the banners and parades, something monstrous was forming. The Ustaše, a fascist movement led by Ante Pavelić, promised loyalty to faith and nation. Their symbol was the cross. Their mission was purity. And soon, that cross would cast one of the darkest shadows in modern European history. The Ustaše's vision of Croatia was built on exclusion. Orthodox Serbs, Jews, and Roma were marked for persecution. The regime announced conversions by the thousands, claiming it would bring people back to the true faith. In reality, many of these conversions were forced, offered as a cruel choice between baptism or death. Churches became the setting for acts of terror, disguised as salvation. Some priests celebrated these ceremonies, believing they were saving souls. Others were horrified, watching the sacred ritual of baptism turned into a weapon. The Vatican's envoys in Zagreb began sending letters to Rome, reporting what they saw, but unsure how far they could speak without endangering the Church's fragile place in the chaos. Among the clergy, opinions fractured. A few saw the Ustaše as defenders of Catholicism against communism and orthodoxy. Others saw through the illusion, recognizing fanaticism dressed as faith. One name stands out: Archbishop Alojzije Stepinac. He supported Croatia's independence, but spoke out when the blood began to flow. From his pulpit, he condemned violence and demanded the protection of all human life, regardless of religion. For this, he was both praised and hated, trapped between loyalty to his people and obedience to his conscience. After the war, he was tried by the communist regime, accused of collaboration, yet many believe he was punished more for his faith than his politics. In the camps of Jasenovac, one of the largest in Europe, horror took on a daily rhythm. Men, women, and children were starved, tortured, and killed in ways too cruel to describe. Survivors later said that even the silence of those who knew felt like betrayal. The Vatican's position during these years remains a matter of debate. Some say Rome did not act strongly enough, choosing caution over confrontation. Others believe that quiet diplomacy and hidden rescues saved more lives than open defiance ever could. But when the war ended, the Church faced a reckoning that could not be escaped. To this day, Croatia's wartime legacy divides families and nations. Statues rise and fall, streets change names. Some still defend the Church's silence as a strategy for survival. Others see it as moral failure. What remains undeniable is that in those years of chaos, the cross itself became a crossroads, where mercy and hatred met face to face. And long after the gunfire stopped, the question still lingers, like a wound that refuses to heal. How many prayers were spoken in good faith, while evil borrowed their language? They never stood in the same room. No handshake, no photograph, no polite exchange of gifts beneath chandeliers. Yet the absence of that meeting became one of the most symbolic gestures of the 20th century. On one side stood Adolf Hitler, a dictator obsessed with image and ceremony. On the other stood Pope Pius XII, a man who ruled from silence and shadows. Between them stretched a gulf of theology, politics, and fear. Both understood that power was as much about what was seen as what was said, and sometimes not being seen together spoke louder than any public alliance. From the beginning, Hitler wanted the meeting. A photo with the Pope would have given him something priceless, legitimacy in the eyes of the Catholic world. It would have been the ultimate seal of approval. a signal that the Church had accepted him as a protector of faith against atheism and communism. His diplomats sent messages, made suggestions, and hinted at visits. Each time, the Vatican found a reason to decline. The Pope's schedule was full, the timing was unsuitable. The tone remained polite, but the door never opened. Pius understood that one image could erase 1,000 cautious words. Instead, their relationship unfolded through distance. Envoys carried messages, bishops served as intermediaries, and every gesture was layered with meaning. When the Vatican signed the Reichskonkordat in 1933, it was meant to protect the Church's rights in Germany. But after that, the Pope kept his distance. He watched as the swastika replaced the cross in public schools, as Catholic newspapers were closed, and as priests were arrested for political crimes. Yet he still refused to meet the dictator face to face. It was not rebellion, but it was not surrender either. It was something in between, a stage play of silence. Hitler noticed. He mocked the Pope's caution in private, but continued to treat the Vatican with uneasy respect. The absence of an audience became a message that the world could read. Pius would not bless his empire, but neither would he openly curse it. For the Church, it was a strategy of survival. For the Reich, it was an opportunity lost. Each side used the distance to craft its own story. Hitler told his followers the Pope secretly admired him. The Vatican told the faithful it had kept its conscience clean. In reality, both were performing for history's camera, careful to leave no picture that could be used against them. As the war raged on, that empty space between them became heavier than any meeting could have been. The absence of a handshake became its own kind of handshake, one that let both sides claim what they needed to believe. After the war, the missing photograph became proof for some of the Pope's innocence and evidence of cowardice for others. But in the end, the truth may be simpler and sadder. In an age when symbols ruled the world, two men who understood power too well played a game of appearances, and silence became their loudest language. While the world slept, the Vatican wrote letters, not sermons or proclamations, but careful, coded messages that moved like whispers across a burning continent. Each one carried the weight of life and death. During the war, the Holy See had no army, no weapons, no borders to defend. What it had was paper, ink, and a network of diplomats who could move through lines that no soldier could cross. They were the Vatican's envoys and nuncios, men who lived in the narrow space between compassion and caution. Their weapons were words, and every sentence had to be shaped with the precision of a prayer. By 1942, Europe was consumed by war. Trains left daily for destinations no one dared to name. Families vanished overnight, and governments crumbled under occupation. In this chaos, the Vatican's diplomats worked in silence. Some were stationed in neutral countries like Switzerland and Portugal. Others remained in cities under Nazi control. Through them, Pius XII sent letters to presidents, generals, and bishops. Some were official, written in the formal language of diplomacy. Others were personal, quiet appeals to mercy, asking a commander to delay a deportation or spare a prisoner. A single word, softened or sharpened, could change a life. Inside the Apostolic Palace, the nights were long. Couriers arrived with sealed envelopes from across Europe. The Pope would read reports from bishops describing massacres, starvation, and persecution. He would answer with instructions that were never to be read aloud. Priests were told to shelter children. Convents were ordered to open their doors. These directives were not announced from balconies, but carried in secret, stamped with the Vatican seal, and passed from hand to trembling hand. The Church had become a silent post office for the desperate. In Rome, the papal diplomatic corps learned the art of invisible influence. They could not threaten or demand, only persuade. A misplaced phrase could close doors forever. Each message was a gamble, a negotiation written between faith and fear. A request to stop a single train might need to pass through 5 embassies, translated and rewritten each time until the original plea was almost unrecognizable. Yet sometimes it worked. A convoy delayed. A border opened. A family spared. And sometimes the silence that followed meant failure too heavy to name. Historians often call this period the Age of Vatican Diplomacy, but to those who lived it, it was an age of sleepless nights. The nuncios worked by candlelight, their desks stacked with letters they could never show. They believed that even if their efforts saved only a few, that few was enough. Pius XII watched from behind his high windows, trusting words to do what armies could not. And though history would question his silence, few knew how many voices filled that silence, writing through the night, trying to buy the world one more breath of mercy before the dawn came again. It is one of history's most haunting questions. What if Pope Pius XII had stood before the world and spoken the truth in thunder instead of whispers? What if, at the height of the war, he had named Adolf Hitler and his regime for what they were and declared them enemies of God? Historians still argue over what that single act might have changed. Some say it would have saved thousands, maybe millions. Others believe it would have unleashed a wave of violence that would have burned through every Catholic church and school in occupied Europe. The silence of that moment became the price of survival, and no one agrees if it was too high. By 1942, the Vatican had enough reports to know what was happening. Bishops from Poland, Holland, and France sent letters describing deportations and camps. Diplomats warned that an open condemnation might provoke Hitler into destroying the church in Germany completely. They said a press release from Rome could become a death sentence for anyone suspected of sympathy with Jews or dissidents. Yet there were others within the church who begged for action, who said that the words of the Pope could pierce through the fog of propaganda like no other voice on earth. Pius faced a dilemma unlike any other in modern history. To speak meant risking the lives of millions of Catholics under Nazi control. To remain silent meant letting evil act without being called by its name. His advisors urged caution. They reminded him that in the Netherlands, when bishops publicly protested the deportation of Jews, the Nazis responded by arresting priests and sending hundreds of Catholics of Jewish descent to the camps. The lesson was brutal and clear. Protest loudly, and people die. Speak softly, and maybe some can still be saved in secret. The Pope chose diplomacy over denunciation. His Christmas radio message of 1942 spoke of the suffering of hundreds of thousands who, through no fault of their own, have been condemned to death. It was a cry without names, a truth wrapped in safety. Some understood who he meant, most did not. For those who needed him to shout, it sounded like a whisper lost in the noise of war. In the years after, the argument grew louder than the war itself. Would an open excommunication of Hitler and his followers have shattered the illusion that God was on the side of the Reich? Would it have inspired resistance or led to mass executions? We will never know. The archives show a man torn between moral clarity and human consequence. His silence was not empty. It was filled with calculation, fear, and faith that quiet action might save what public outrage could destroy. The price of that choice is still debated. History remembers both the lives saved in secret and the millions who perished in darkness. Whether his silence was protection or failure, it proved one thing beyond doubt. In an age where words could move armies, sometimes not speaking was the loudest sound of all. Every mystery begins with a locked door, but sometimes the silence behind it speaks louder than what is found inside. For decades, historians have searched the Vatican's archives, looking for the truth about what Pope Pius XII knew during the war and what he chose not to say. Inside those endless corridors are millions of pages, letters written in careful Latin, telegrams in fading ink, and files stamped secret. But the story is not just about what has been uncovered. It is about the gaps, the missing folders, the sudden breaks in the record that seem to vanish exactly where the questions begin. The file that isn't there has become as powerful as the ones that are. When the Vatican announced in the year 2020 that it would finally open its wartime archives, scholars from around the world rushed to Rome. They expected revelations that would end decades of argument. What they found instead was something stranger, a puzzle half complete. There were reports from bishops describing deportations, letters pleading for help, and documents proving that the Pope was far more informed than the world once believed. But there were also long silences in the record, missing dates, gaps in correspondence, sections of files that end mid-sentence. It was as if history itself had taken a deep breath and refused to exhale. Some believe these absences are the result of time and chaos, the natural decay of paper and bureaucracy. Others are not so sure. They see patterns in the missing material, files that would have revealed sensitive relationships between church officials and governments, or personal notes from the Pope that might have shown more fear than faith. The Vatican insists that nothing has been deliberately hidden, that every surviving document is open to inspection. Yet for researchers, the feeling remains that the silence of the archives is not accidental. It feels curated, almost designed. Among the papers that do exist, there are moments of haunting detail. A note from a priest in Poland describing children being taken from orphanages. A telegram from a bishop in France warning of mass arrests. Letters from Jewish organizations begging for Vatican intervention. Each one is a fragment of a vast story, and between them lie the empty spaces that haunt every historian. Because it is in those blank spaces that speculation grows. The missing pages become a mirror where people project their beliefs about Pius XII, seeing either a cautious saviour or a cowardly diplomat. What absence says is as important as what presence reveals. The missing file may not hide conspiracy, but uncertainty. The confusion of a church trying to survive in an age where truth was punished. Perhaps some records were destroyed to protect others. Perhaps some were never written because writing them would have meant admitting too much. In the end, the gaps are not just holes in history, they are the echo of decisions made in fear, faith, and secrecy. And until every missing page is found, or every silence is explained, the ghost of that file will continue to whisper from the shelves, reminding the world that sometimes what isn't written tells the greatest story of all. History often paints the church as a single voice, but in truth it was 1,000 voices speaking all at once, some in courage, some in fear, and some simply trying to survive. During the war years, the Vatican was not only a palace of marble and ritual, but also a crossroads of humanity. Inside its walls were saints, sinners, and secretaries, each carrying their own burden, each making choices that would echo far beyond their lifetimes. They were not all heroes, nor were they all villains. They were people trapped in the storm of history, trying to hold on to faith in a world where faith had become dangerous. There were priests who risked everything, forging papers, hiding refugees, and sheltering Jews under false names. Many of them never received recognition. Some died without anyone knowing what they had done. In convents across Europe, nuns disguised children and smuggled them to safety, whispering prayers as they passed soldiers in the dark. Their courage was quiet, but immeasurable. These were the saints of the shadows, the ones who saw moral duty not as a command from Rome, but as something that lived inside the human heart. They were guided by compassion, not permission. Then there were the secretaries, the men who worked behind desks, filing reports, sending telegrams, and translating the chaos of war into the careful language of bureaucracy. To some, they were just doing their jobs. To others, they were the gears that kept the Vatican's great machine running while the world burned. Some of these men truly believed they were helping, that by staying calm and organized, they could hold back the tide of madness. Others hid behind their paperwork, afraid to feel what they were documenting. They typed the tragedies of the world in silence, hoping that obedience would keep them safe. And there were sinners, those who chose comfort over conscience, who looked away when the suffering came too close. They were not monsters, just men who failed when the moment to act arrived. The Church has always been filled with such contrasts, light and shadow in the same hall. Pius XII himself stood at the centre of it, surrounded by voices offering advice, warning, or denial. Every letter he received reflected one of these faces: a plea from a rescuer, a report from a diplomat, a reminder from a bureaucrat that caution was still policy. The Vatican became less an institution than an orchestra, its music shifting between mercy and restraint. After the war, people tried to divide these stories into neat categories, to name heroes and condemn cowards. But history rarely allows clean lines. The same man who saved one life might have stayed silent about another. The nun who sheltered children might have prayed beside those who betrayed them. The Church was not one story, but many, and together they form a chorus of humanity at its most complex. In the end, the lesson is not about perfection or failure. It is about the countless choices made in moments no one saw, and how even the smallest act of courage can echo louder than the grandest silence. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world demanded answers. The ruins of Europe were not only made of stone and ash, but of conscience. The Nuremberg trials became the great stage where justice tried to speak after years of silence. The courtroom was a theatre of memory, where soldiers, officials, and witnesses stepped forward to tell the story of humanity's darkest hours. But even here, the echoes of the Church could be heard. Testimonies mentioned priests who blessed armies, chaplains who comforted murderers, and sermons that had once blended faith with obedience. The trials were meant to judge crimes, yet they also exposed the complicated bond between belief and guilt. As the evidence was presented, the Church's shadow stretched across the transcripts. Some defendants claimed they were only following orders. Others said they had believed they were defending Christian civilization from atheism and chaos. The language of religion had been used to justify unthinkable acts. In the courtrooms, that language was turned inside out. Judges and prosecutors read documents quoting speeches that invoked God while plotting genocide. For many watching, it was proof that even sacred words could be corrupted when spoken in service of power. In Rome, the Vatican followed the trials closely but carefully. The Holy See was not on trial, but its silence was. Newspapers printed questions that had been whispered for years. Did the Pope know about the camps? Could he have done more? Why had the Church not excommunicated the men who committed these crimes? Vatican officials avoided public comment, hoping that the trials would close wounds rather than open new ones. But the world's memory had changed. People wanted not only justice, but confession. They wanted the Church to speak. Among the witnesses were men and women who had found shelter in monasteries, who spoke gratefully of nuns and priests who had risked their lives to save them. Their testimonies reminded the court that faith had also been a refuge, that holiness had not vanished even in horror. But other witnesses told a different story. They described priests who had stayed silent, bishops who had looked away, and chaplains who had blessed soldiers as they marched to slaughter. The contradictions revealed the truth that the Church, like the world itself, was divided between courage and fear. When the verdicts were read and the guilty were sentenced, a new trial began outside the courtroom, a trial of memory. Historians, survivors, and believers all began to write their own versions of what had happened. Each story was like a liturgy of remembrance, a ritual meant to make sense of what could never truly be understood. The Nuremberg trials judged men, but history would judge institutions. And in that judgment, the Vatican found itself standing in a quiet corner, not condemned, not absolved, but waiting, as it always had, for the world to decide what silence really meant. History turned him into a ghost long before he was gone. Pope Pius XII, the man who once ruled from behind the marble walls of the Vatican, became something more than human after the war ended. To some, he was a quiet hero, the shepherd who worked in secret to save lives. To others, he was a coward, the Pope who stayed silent while the world burned. For years, the argument stayed inside books and archives, debated by scholars and priests. But in 1963, it left the libraries and stepped onto the stage. That was the year Rolf Hohuth's play The Deputy premiered, and the Pope became a character in the world's most uncomfortable story. The play accused Pius of moral failure, of choosing diplomacy over compassion, of knowing too much and saying too little. On stage, he was portrayed as a man frozen by fear, watching genocide unfold while hiding behind holy caution. Audiences across Europe were shocked. For many, it was the first time they had even questioned the Vatican's role in the war. The Church denounced the play, calling it slander dressed as art, but the damage was done. The image of the silent Pope had entered public imagination. History had found its villain, or at least its symbol of inaction. In the years that followed, artists, writers, and activists continued to wrestle with that image. Some painted Pius as a tragic figure, trapped between impossible choices. Others saw him as the embodiment of institutional cowardice. Films and documentaries echoed the same question Hochhuth had asked. What is the price of neutrality when the world is drowning in evil? The Vatican responded with its own version of the story, publishing collections of wartime documents meant to prove that Pius had worked tirelessly through back channels to help Jews and refugees. But the more the Church defended him, the more the debate grew. Every explanation seemed to open another wound. Modern historians entered the fight armed with new evidence. Letters, diaries, and testimonies revealed that the Vatican had indeed hidden many Jews within its walls and convents. Yet they also showed moments when opportunities for louder protest had been avoided. Pius became both hero and ghost, saint and shadow, depending on who held the pen. Even the opening of the Vatican archives in the 21st century did not silence the argument. Instead, it deepened it. Researchers found proof of compassion and proof of caution, often on the same page. Art and scholarship continue to collide in this story. Plays, novels, and films keep resurrecting the image of Pius, forcing new generations to confront the same question that haunted his life. Was silence his weapon or his wound? The stage has become a courtroom where history and memory perform their endless trial. The man once known for his quiet diplomacy is now the loudest presence in the conversation about morality and power. Pius XII may have chosen silence in life, but in death, he became the most debated voice of the modern church, echoing through every retelling, reminding us that truth, like faith, is never simple. After the war ended, when the camps were liberated and the survivors began to speak, letters started arriving in Rome. Some came from rabbis, some from families who had hidden in convents, and others from those who had lost everything but their voices. They were addressed to the Vatican, to the Pope, and to the priests and nuns who had helped them survive. Many were filled with gratitude, others carried pain, confusion, and anger. Together, they formed a dialogue between two worlds that had shared the same darkness, but not always the same truth. There were Jewish survivors who wrote with deep emotion, thanking the church for opening its doors when no one else would. They told stories of priests who forged baptism papers, of nuns who risked death to hide children in orphanages, of monasteries that became sanctuaries. These letters called Pius XII a protector and praised him for acting quietly when open defiance would have brought ruin. Some even said that without the Vatican's network, thousands more would have died. These voices saw the church not as a bystander, but as a secret lifeline. But there were other letters too, ones filled with grief and disbelief. They came from those who asked why the Pope had not spoken sooner, why the church had not shouted from every pulpit when the trains began to roll. Some rabbis questioned how a faith that preached compassion could remain silent while millions were murdered. To them, the Vatican's quiet diplomacy looked like indifference. They did not doubt that individual priests had shown great courage, but they wondered how the institution that claimed moral authority over the world could have chosen silence as strategy. Over the years, these conflicting voices shaped the fragile relationship between Catholics and Jews. Meetings were held, apologies offered, and friendships slowly built out of the ruins. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 changed the tone further, as the Church struggled to understand its place in a world that was redefining its moral compass. Some Jewish leaders met with Vatican officials, searching not for vengeance, but for acknowledgement. They wanted to hear the words, "We knew," and "We are sorry." For many, that acknowledgement came too late, and for some, it never came at all. In the 1960s, when the Second Vatican Council issued its declaration rejecting the idea that Jews were collectively responsible for the death of Christ, it marked a turning point. It was a gesture of healing that took centuries to arrive. Jewish and Catholic scholars began working together to uncover the true story of the wartime years. They discovered moments of extraordinary bravery alongside failures that could never be undone. The voices of the survivors, the letters of thanks, the words of sorrow, all continue to echo through time. They remind the Church that history is not erased by prayer alone, and they remind the world that silence, even when meant to protect, can wound just as deeply as hatred. Between the gratitude and the grief lies the fragile truth of memory, a shared humanity that survived even when faith itself nearly broke. The question of sainthood was supposed to be about holiness, not history. Yet when the Vatican began the process to canonize Pope Pius XII, the debate turned into a battlefield. His defenders called him a man of deep faith who led the Church through its darkest hour. His critics called him the silent Pope who failed to speak when the world needed moral thunder. Between those two visions stood a mountain of documents and the ghosts of millions. The path to canonization, once meant to honor a life of virtue, became a test of truth itself. The first calls to recognize Pius as a saint began soon after his death in 1958. Supporters said his calm leadership had protected the Church from destruction, and his quiet diplomacy had saved countless lives during the war. Letters poured in from those who claimed to have been rescued through Vatican networks. They spoke of convents that sheltered families, of priests who acted under his instructions, and of Jews who survived because of orders signed in his name. For them, sainthood was not a question, but a confirmation. They believed his silence had been strategy, and that beneath it had been courage. But others saw the move as an insult to memory. Historians, rabbis, and survivors argued that declaring Pius a saint before the full archives were open would mean canonizing mystery instead of truth. They asked how the Church could celebrate his holiness while still refusing to release every record from the wartime years. "No miracles without documents," one historian wrote, capturing the heart of the debate. The Vatican responded that canonization was about faith, not politics, but faith, like history, could not escape the light. When Pope John Paul II made Pius XII venerable in the year 2009, the discussion reignited. To some, it was a sign of respect. To others, it felt premature. The Jewish community expressed concern, saying that until the archives were fully examined, no one could know the complete truth of what Pius had done or failed to do. The Vatican promised transparency, but bureaucracy and time moved slowly. Even after Pope Francis opened the wartime records in 2020, the arguments continued. Each newly found letter seemed to prove one side right and then the other. Canonization became less about miracles and more about moral accounting. Was holiness measured by intention or by outcome? Did saving lives in secret outweigh the pain of public silence? The process, still unresolved, stands as one of the most delicate in modern church history. Every step forward feels like walking through a field of memory where one wrong move could reignite old wounds. For the faithful who see Pius as a saint, his caution was wisdom. For those who still mourn the silence, it was failure. Between them lies the same question that has haunted every chapter of his story. Can a man who spoke softly in a time of horror be remembered as holy, or must holiness shout to be heard? After the war, Europe was a continent of ghosts. Cities were rubble, armies scattered, and borders blurred by fear. In the chaos, hundreds of thousands fled, some seeking a new beginning, others running from justice. It was in this confusion that the secret escape networks, known as the rat lines, were born. At first, they were meant for refugees, for soldiers without homes, and for those who feared Soviet prisons. But soon, they became lifelines for men who had committed the unthinkable. The routes that led to safety in South America carried not only the innocent, but also the guilty. And somewhere in the middle of it all stood the Church, trying to balance mercy with morality. The rat lines began in the late 1940s, stretching from monasteries in Austria and Italy to ships bound for Argentina, Chile, and Brazil. The Red Cross, overwhelmed by millions of displaced people, issued temporary travel papers to anyone who could claim a clean identity. With forged baptism records and the right signatures, a war criminal could become a refugee overnight. Many passed through the College of St. Jerome and the German seminary in Rome, where priests offered shelter and advice. Some did it out of compassion, others out of sympathy for the fallen regime. The line between charity and complicity disappeared in the fog of post-war desperation. The Vatican's role remains one of history's most sensitive questions. Officially, the Church denied any organized effort to help Nazis escape. Yet, letters and testimonies reveal that certain bishops and priests provided guidance, documents, and safe passage. The most famous was Bishop Alois Hudal, who believed even the guilty deserved mercy and a chance to repent. To him, the Allies' trials looked like vengeance disguised as justice. He saw himself as a priest offering redemption, not protection. But his idea of redemption helped men like Adolf Eichmann and Joseph Mengele vanish into new lives far from the ruins of Europe. Not everyone inside the Church approved. Many priests condemned what they saw as betrayal of the victims. They argued that mercy without truth was not forgiveness but denial. Yet the network grew, fueled by money, ideology, and a strange sense of divine duty. Some historians believe the Vatican turned a blind eye to individual acts, rather than risk exposing the scale of the operation. Others think the Church simply lost control of its own agents in a world where moral boundaries had collapsed. By the time the world began to uncover the truth in the 1950s, the damage was done. The rat lines had already delivered thousands to new lives under false names. The governments that welcomed them were often eager to use their skills, caring little about their pasts. Decades later, when survivors and journalists began tracing the trails, the Church faced questions it still struggles to answer. What should mercy look like after genocide? Does forgiveness end where justice begins? The rat lines remind us that even compassion can be dangerous when stripped of accountability, and that sometimes the path to heaven can begin with a passport stamped in silence. History keeps its own kind of bookkeeping. Every silence, every sermon, every hidden act of mercy becomes an entry in a moral ledger that can never truly be balanced. When the war ended and the smoke lifted from Europe, the world began counting. It counted the dead, the displaced, the survivors. It also began counting the actions of the Church, trying to measure what it had done, what it had allowed, and what it had failed to imagine. The numbers could never tell the full story, but they mattered because they were the closest thing to proof that humanity had learned something from the wreckage. In the Vatican, the reckoning came slowly. Pius XII had led the Church through the war, believing that silence and diplomacy would save more lives than protest. After his death, others were left to add up the consequences of that decision. How many people were saved through church networks, forged documents, and secret shelters? Historians estimate that tens of thousands of Jews were hidden in monasteries and convents under orders that came from Rome. Sometimes directly, sometimes through whispers. Those lives form one side of the ledger, the side of compassion and courage. But the other side is heavier. It carries the weight of millions who died without hearing a single word of public condemnation from the Vatican's throne. The ledger also includes those who acted in defiance of the Church's caution. Priests who spoke against the Nazis from their pulpits and paid with their lives. Nuns who ignored orders and protected children. Bishops who risked arrest to condemn what they saw. Their names are remembered in small towns, on plaques, and in testimonies recorded long after they were gone. They represent what the Church could have been if fear had not been its guiding star. For each one who resisted, hundreds obeyed the order to stay neutral, believing that survival was more holy than confrontation. Numbers can show us patterns, but they cannot measure courage. They cannot capture the sleepless nights of a nun forging papers, or the terror of a priest watching soldiers search his church. They cannot explain how an institution that preached love could hesitate when faced with evil. What they can show is scale, the vast shadow of choices made and unmade. They show how the Church prevented countless tragedies while allowing others to unfold unchecked. When historians and theologians study this era, they are not just counting people, they are counting possibilities, asking what might have happened if words had been louder, if warnings had come sooner, if mercy had been matched with truth. The ledger of choices is not meant to condemn, but to remember, because behind every number is a face, and behind every silence is a decision. The Church's story during the war is neither all light nor all darkness. It is a balance sheet of humanity itself, written in the ink of courage, fear, and faith. And like every moral ledger, it remains open, waiting for history to decide what still must be paid. Power forgets. Memory does not. That is the truth written in the margins of every history book and whispered in every archive that still smells of dust and ink. The story of the Vatican and the Second World War is not one tale, but many, woven from silence, courage, fear, and survival. Institutions protect themselves. Individuals risk everything to save others. Between those two truths lies the question that refuses to fade. When is silence wisdom, and when does it become a sin that history will never forgive? The Vatican's story has always been about control, about guarding the sacred from chaos. But during the war, control came at a cost, measured not in coins or politics, but in lives. Pius XII believed that silence could be a weapon, that discretion was a form of mercy. His defenders still argue that his quiet diplomacy saved thousands through secret channels. His critics answer that his caution allowed evil to grow unchecked. The truth is somewhere in between, in the space where power hesitates and people act. While Rome debated, priests and nuns across Europe made their own choices. They forged papers, hid refugees, and prayed that heaven would forgive them for breaking rules written by men. Their courage was not recorded in ledgers. It lived in the shadows, in whispered prayers, and open doors at midnight. Decades later, the archives began to open. The pages told stories that both vindicated and condemned. There were letters begging for help, reports describing horrors, and memos filled with polite language meant to disguise despair. For every document that showed compassion, another revealed hesitation. Historians turned each page like an excavation, uncovering not only what happened, but what had been chosen not to be said. The missing files still speak, not with words, but with absence. Silence has its own kind of voice, and it is often louder than confession. The Church today stands in a strange place, both proud and haunted. It speaks of reconciliation, of lessons learned, of faith tested by history, yet the same questions echo through its halls. Could the voice of God's representative on earth have changed the course of the world, or was the world too far gone for any voice to matter? No archive can answer that completely. Documents tell us what men did. They cannot always tell us what they feared or what they prayed for in the dark. The final reckoning belongs not to the church, but to memory. History is patient. It waits for truth to surface, for the courage to look at it without flinching. The Vatican still guards its papers, but more doors are opening each year. One day, perhaps, we will read everything they finally let us see. Until then, the story remains unfinished, suspended between silence and revelation. Power may forget the lessons of its own past, but memory remembers for all of us, keeping watch, line by line, until the last page is turned and the last silence is broken.